he hasn't minced his words, has he? He's been very firm on this idea of identity politics causing division.
It's actually quite extraordinary for a very significant Western political leader to make such an explicit condemnation of the American style racial culture wars. And he points specifically to intersectionality, which is this idea that there are different oppressions that intersect in all of these different power structures. And so we need to consider not just people's race, but their gender, their sexuality, and all of these types of things. And so, yeah, it's quite extraordinary. And this isn't the first time that he's made a statement like this. Actually, in the height of the summer Black Lives Matter protests last year in June, he spoke out against statue toppling, condemning it as erasing French history. And this was quite striking, actually, particularly in contrast to Boris Johnson, who was quite criticised at the time for not being stronger against the vandalism of the cenotaph and the fact that the statue of Winston Churchill was boarded up. And many people thought that he needed to be much more forthright. I think it is interesting, though, that he is kind of focusing on America as the point of bringing in racialization. Whilst I do think that that is true, this very particular American style is quite problematic for our understanding of how different races interact with each other. I think France in particular does have a strong history of a kind of racial culture wars, whether that is the discussions over the last 10 years around the niqab and the burqa, the kind of French ghettos in relation to the banlieue, and how many North African people who originate from former colonies of France do have challenges in relation to their sense of French identity and how they think about themselves as French in contrast to their North African origins. So there has been conversations about race and racism shaping French public discourse for several years, but this particular American style one is new, and I think he's very right to be quite explicit in challenging it.
Yeah, and thanks for the invitation to join the conversation. Not that I ever felt that you two weren't up for it, but it is interesting, isn't it? It's brave on the one hand, he's very bold, he's telling America where to go in some ways, but it's notwithstanding the serious problems they do have in France, what he's trying to do is focus on what unites us, or them rather than what divides them. And the French have always tried to have an idea of them all being, members of a republic signed up to principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And it's the atomization that goes with everybody becoming what they are, what they identify, that destroys any sense of statehood. I guess that's what worries him, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it is quite interesting. In France, they don't take racial data, and that is because of a history of racial profiling and things related to that. So they've made an explicit decision several years ago to not collect data related to race and ethnicity. That has been criticised by some people, and they've criticised it as saying that we're not actually aware of how if there are racial disparities and inequalities in France because they don't take that data. But I think in terms of the vision for French society, it's an incredibly compelling one, that race shouldn't define people, that you should sign up to these unifying principles of equality, as you mentioned, fraternity and liberty, and this kind of inclusive notion of Frenchness, which should transcend people's particularities, is one that I think would be very strongly positively embraced if we heard some of those messages from on high in British society as well.
Inaya, I remember many elections ago, the Conservatives had a poster that showed a black police officer, I think, and they say, Labour say he's black, we say he's British. Yeah. And that's the kind of sentiment.
Yeah, and on that, I mean, what you mentioned there, it would be welcome to see people in this country, particularly politicians and people in power, expressing these sentiments and critiquing this idea that, we should all be divided based on whatever identity we happen to have. Do you think we can never expect that from our government? Because I haven't particularly heard Conservative MPs, because you wouldn't really expect it from Labour. So if somebody's going to come out and critique identity politics, we would expect it to be Conservative politicians. But you don't get them coming out much and being firm on this idea. And perhaps it's because they're scared of being accused of you know, whatever it is, being homophobic, transphobic, racist, if they come out and critique these ideas. But is there hope for those of us like me who do want to see politicians coming out like Macron has done and being very firm and saying, no, we completely reject this idea, it's divisive, and actually we just think we want to see everybody as just a human being?
I absolutely agree. And I think when it comes to British politicians, I think the challenge is consistency. I think that sometimes people on the left and the right in government, in parliament, have played that identity politics game, and so it may seem quite inconsistent if they now came out saying something different. But I think it would be positive because we've had so many conversations about race. There was a poll several months ago by YouGov which found that 55% of British people felt that the Black Lives Matter protests had actually increased racial divisions within society. So there's a lot of scope for politicians to take this opportunity to actually articulate a much more positive, unifying vision of British society, which doesn't define people by their racial identity or any kind of category of identity such as gender or sexuality, and actually articulate a much more universal vision. So I think it's positive that Emmanuel Macron is taking the lead on that, and I think that many politicians here should take note.
Inaya, always a real pleasure to have you on, and thank you for your thoughts there.